En Afrique et en Asie, augmenter la compétitivité des produits finis tout en réduisant la facture énergétique grâce à la valorisation de biomasse représente un enjeu économique majeur pour les pays pour maximiser la valeur ajoutée nationale qu'en matière de création d'emplois. Ces industries peuvent par exemple concerner la transformation de la noix de cajou, du riz ou encore du bois. Néanmoins, la gestion des résidus de transformation et l'approvisionnement est coûteux pour les industriels. Le projet AgroGazelec, appuyé par le Fonds français pour l'environnement mondial, a pour vocation de les valoriser en les transformant en électricité au sein même des agro-industries. S'ils sont gérés de manière durable, ces résidus deviennent une opportunité pour ces entreprises. Leur facture d'électricité est effacée et ils peuvent également bénéficier de revenus complémentaires avec la revente de biocharbon ou de l'excédent d'électricité sur le réseau électrique. L'objectif du programme est de développer une solution viable pour la valorisation des résidus agricoles et agro-industriels à travers leur gazéification et la production d'électricité dans des groupes électrogènes adaptés. De par sa modularité, cette technologie est adaptée pour des puissances entre 100 kW et 2 MW électriques. Cela passe notamment par la capitalisation d'expériences où ED Invest opère ce type de centrale depuis 2011 afin de transférer cette technologie ainsi que sa fabrication en Afrique de l'Ouest. La réalisation de projets pilotes permettra de mettre l'accent sur l'appropriation locale à travers de la formation et de répliquer ce modèle dans la sous-région, que ce soit à partir de coques d'anacarde, de balles de riz ou de résidus issus de la transformation du bois par exemple. Le programme AgroGazelec favorisera ainsi le développement du tissu économique local, la transition énergétique ainsi que la protection de l'environnement.
MEA was founded in 1990 and listed on the air share market in 2012. MEA is China's leading high-tech enterprise focusing on the R&D and manufacturing of optotronic intelligent identification equipment. MEA is committed to applying intelligent identification technology to cashew sorting and processing by developing a full range of cashew color sorters, such as CF series, KM series, KF series, KFS3 series, K4 series, KS4 series, CG.A series, M series, XS series, XM series, XL series, etc. The whole scene sorting solution can be provided to raw cashew separation, whole cashew separation, split separation, broken pieces separation, tester separation, scorched separation, medium spot separation, shell separation, foreign material separation, and so on. MEA brand new cashew color sorter equipped with AI deep learning technology based on massive cashew sorting data can quickly build and iterate deep learning sorting models to break the problems of micro-color difference, mold and spores which are difficult to solve with traditional color sorters, significantly improving the sorting efficiency and impurities such as single spot, multiple spot, micro-color difference, skin, insect spots, mold and wrinkled skin of cashew kernels. In addition, based on engineering design and intelligent manufacturing, the structure of the whole machine is highly standardized and modularized, which greatly enhance the stability and reliability. MEA is dedicated to creating more value for cashew processors.
Recording in progress.
Good morning and welcome to another session of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. The session is available in French and English, and you can access either of these languages via the globe icon on the bottom left side of your screen. As announced during the last webinar, today, beyond our regular markets, production and trade updates, from our expert Jim Fitzpatrick, we'll be discussing the theme as the market forgotten cashew farms. And to do so, we are receiving a special guest, Herman with the Bosch from the Farmers Support. But before we delve into today's session, I would like to remind you that the webinar is streamed live on the ACA Facebook page and YouTube channel, where you could also find the recording of every single past session. And so far, we have 81. The webinar is also made possible because of the support from our partners and sponsors. I would like to mention the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ Move Com Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nuts Initiative, and the Cashew Club. Also, we are 160 days to the 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Exposition. The countdown to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania is on. Register now before August 30th and enjoy the early bird rates on all conference rates. During today's session, you can ask questions and leave comments in the discussion box below. Now, let's delve into the session. Good morning, Jim.
Morning, Stella. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Well, I'm soldiering on as always.
We are ready for you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to talk about the markets, as we always do. I'll update on our opinion on production and trade. And as Stella mentioned, we're going to ask this question: has the market forgotten farmers? And from Fairmatch Support, Herman de Bosch will give us his views on that, and we're going to have a conversation and invite you to participate in that conversation. If you've got questions, if you've got comments, talk to us. So let's get on and talk about the market and some of the trends. Well, it's not been a particularly dramatic couple of weeks since we were last with you, but it looks as if a little bit of pressure has come on cashew prices, particularly on cashew kernels. When we look at the forces, so I look at the red forces pushing market prices down and the blue forces pushing it the other way, what we see is that, generally speaking, raw cashew nut prices are easing a little bit. They've continued to fall, mostly on physical arrivals at destination. The crops, well, interestingly, and we'll come back to this, the crops appear to be getting bigger, or at least the estimates do. In India, the biggest market, kernels demand looks a little bit soft for the time being. And we will expect in July, and July could be an interesting time in this business, in many businesses, but in July we may start to see what happens with prices, particularly in Western markets, as prices in supermarkets start to go up after last year's sharp price increase. We'll also see in July some discussion, perhaps a resolution of the United States import tariffs issues, particularly with Vietnam, with that 46% tariff threat hanging over the Vietnamese cashew sector as it stands. And we also see the impact in the second half of the year of low forward sales. Now, will buyers come in and top up, or have they had enough? That we'll see, and we'll start to see some clarity on that from July onwards. There are fewer arguments, I'm afraid, on the other side, on the higher prices argument. Definitely interesting, surprising, very strong export figures from Vietnam on cashew kernels for the month of May. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later too, but remarkable numbers. The low forward cover, of course, has both sides. I said low forward sales is bearish factor, and it has been on RCN, but that could change into a bullish factor if buyers come in to cover those contracts. Not so sure if that'll happen. On the other hand, there is still margin pressure, profit margin pressure on processors, not to mention on exporters and traders of raw cashew nuts who are holding high value inventory and possibly looking at disappointing returns on that. Obviously, that's going to make people reluctant to get further involved to sell, but they may not have a choice. So we have a lot of factors going on. I think really what we're seeing is something of a correction from last year's rise in prices. I'm not particularly bearish. I don't think that this market will go below $3 a pound for 320s FOB. I'm not sure if it will even reach $3 a pound. But on the other hand, I'm not particularly bullish either. Good crops, prospect of further good crops, and question marks over demand are all going to play a part in the second half of the year. So let's have a look at trade. Have a look at the trade situation. So we'll have a quick look at raw cashew nut prices. And what we can see is a combination of lower quality, which is typical in Cote d'Ivoire, in Nigeria, as the season goes on. And there we've seen prices drop off a little bit. Where quality is good and where the raw nuts are freshly harvested in Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia and Senegal, we've also seen a drop off in price, but I would suggest maybe those prices started too high anyway, and they needed to drift down a little bit. So we're seeing the quality falling in the early harvesting areas, particularly Cote d'Ivoire. Nigeria is almost finished. Ghana's finished. So that early part of West Africa is closing to the end, but there are some inventories left. So we have some inventories in Cote d'Ivoire, as we discussed last time around. There are inventories in Guinea-Bissau unsold, as there should be at this time of year. Perhaps the forward sales are a little bit less than you would normally expect. Market prices for kernels and for RCN still work for the Indian market. Indian kernels market is much higher than the international market. But the calculation for Vietnam, even with these low RCN prices, for many, that's been matched by lower kernels prices, particularly smaller and medium processors. And that means that calculation still looks very tight. No processor is making a major margin in this market right now. Buyers, raw cashew nut buyers, will wait. They'll wait as long as they can, but their calendar moves on. And it looks to me, given India's imports about 140,000 tons in the first quarter of RCN, and Vietnam's imports, even though at record levels, they do need to buy. Transforming that product from in a warehouse in West Africa to in a processing plant in India or Vietnam is a long process. So they do need still to come to the market, although they're probably in a better position than we might have expected 6, 8, 10 weeks ago. Quick look at the kernel situation. Again, kernels prices relatively unchanged. What I think is noticeable here is that the gap between the top processors and the smaller processors or exporters is widening. That's often a signal of cash flow pressure in the market. Sometimes it's a signal that the market has dropped as much as it is going to drop. I'm not necessarily sure that's correct right now, but it does look as if that gap's widening. In Vietnam, prices have drifted down. Now, you're not going to buy, I've written 315 to 330. You're not going to buy from top processors at 315 for 320s. You're going to have to pay much more than that. But that's the range that's quoted, and that influences the thinking in the market. It's about a year since prices spiked up, since we saw that fairly dramatic rise in prices, since we saw prices eventually hit $3.60, momentarily perhaps, but they did, and then come back. And when they came back, they weren't far off today's range. So we have seen relative price stability for about a year on kernels, within within a range. Interesting too is that demand, at least on the basis of the statistics in terms of shipments, in terms of imports and exports, demand still remains resilient. Buyers will be watching the trends. They will be watching the impact of higher retail prices in Western countries. They will be watching the impact of tariffs. They will be looking to see in the second half of the year how those are impacting demand overall. But at the same time, this could stay relatively stable over the coming weeks. So continuing on the trend of trade, and let's have a look at Vietnam. So as everyone knows, Vietnam is the largest exporter of kernels, the largest importer of raw cashew nuts. So what happens there is really important in the future of the market globally. And what we've seen is that imports during the month of May, figures became available late last week, imports for the month of May were at record levels. And at this stage of the year, we are 10.4% up on last year's numbers. So Vietnam is pretty well supplied. And if we look at the chart on the right-hand side, you can see how month by month, we've just seen a big turnaround. So the year started relatively quietly. So the red bars represent imports in 2025. And you can see March was poor, and we were looking at reduced supply for Vietnamese processors. But then came April with remarkable import figure, and May has continued, and this has been driven mainly by imports from Cambodia. So when we look at the import figures, what we see in the month of May is 120 plus thousand tons imported from Cambodia, which is unusual for the time of year. And it causes me to have another look at our estimates of production in Cambodia this year, which we'll do in a moment. Meantime, let's look at the export side. So we're looking at January to May export of kernels, and I've picked out those 5 key regions and the key countries within those regions, which between them account for about 80% of Vietnam's exports. And what we see is, comparing 2023 in blue, 2024 in orange, and in grey 2025, what we're seeing is really strong growth in China. So January to May, Vietnam's exports to China up by 23%. This is significant. It's not just seasonal demand, it's something more than that. On the other hand, we see the US market, and probably not at all surprising, the US market's down by 21%. So these are shipments from Vietnam. Now, interestingly, during May, shipments to the United States were quite healthy, around about average. I think it was 17,000 tons. That's around about average. So there did appear to be still some optimism around shipments. Now, whether they can get in before the 9th of July deadline, when the 10% duty rate expires, or whether people now believe that that 10% will be continued, remains to be seen. We're seeing 21% down for the year to date, but let's not forget that in 2024 we saw a 23% increase in imports for the year, which was way ahead of the increase in consumption. Now, there was an increase in consumption in the United States, but imports were well ahead of that. So they would have carried in an inventory into 2025. And that partially explains, together with the tariffs, the drop-off in shipments from Vietnam. Europe, down 6% on last year. What I would say, though, was the start to last year was exceptional. And it evened out as the year went on. So I'm still looking at Europe as relatively positive. We haven't really seen the impact of the higher prices at the consumer level. I wouldn't expect to see that have a major impact till perhaps the first quarter of next year, but we'll know whether or not it will have an impact relatively quickly, probably by September. West Asia, so West Asia covers what we used to call the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asian countries, and that's up 1%. Healthy growth in the circumstances of higher prices. And the rest of Asia is down by 10%. And I'm not quite sure how to explain that. Last year was a pretty good year, but if we look at 2025, it is slightly below the 2023 numbers. So we need to take another look at that. These figures are from Vietnam's Customs Authority, which we always use for consistency. And you might find some other figures elsewhere that tell not a majorly different story, but a slightly different story. Be careful who you listen to, as always. So let's have a look and see, what does all of this mean for Vietnam? So we calculate our balance sheet. Starting stock hasn't changed. The crop around about 300,000 tons. Disappointing, not disastrous. Vietnam imports most of its raw cashew nuts. And then we come to imports. So we're up around about this 10%, 1.32 million tons. That's big. I'm guessing at the imports of Burma kernels. Now, there are obviously imports of Burma kernels. My thinking is they happen later in the year. Last year, it was estimated at 100,000 tons. So I'm putting in a fairly conservative number at this stage. That will grow, but I think it will only grow from imports during June onwards. So Ivory Coast, Nigeria, possibly Mozambique. It'll be interesting to see the effect of the new tax on Burma kernels that was introduced in Mozambique. That will add to the supply. Exports, after this phenomenal May, and it was phenomenal, exports roughly match imports. So if we take the exports and a little bit of domestic, convert that, I use 22% as a conversion factor. It might be a bit conservative, but it's there or thereabouts. This is what you get. 1.32 million tons has been exported. I think there's about 350,000 tons on the water at the ports, not yet imported. That's from Ivory Coast, it's from Nigeria, it's from several countries, obviously. And that would give us a balance of about 826,000 tons, or about 3 months processing stock, which at this time of year you would say is adequate, given that there's further shipments and plenty of further shipments to come from West Africa. You'd say that's pretty adequate. In fact, it might be a little bit on the high side, depending on what's been shipped from origin. And looking at what's been shipped from origin, so now we're looking at imports of raw cashew nuts, and we're going to see if we can get an idea from the January-May figures of what remains to come. So if we look at Cambodia, we're looking at May, 122,000 tons of import, up 13% for the year. Ivory Coast, 55,000 tons only imported so far. That's down 50% for the year so far. Meantime, Nigeria during May recovered, and we're getting back toward good numbers for Nigeria. And Ghana, shipments still behind where they were this time last year. So we're seeing the arrival of physical raw material, raw cashew nuts into Vietnam, following on from the large Cambodian crop, and before that, bigger imports from East Africa than we've seen for some time. Nigeria is catching up, so the shipments are beginning to arrive. Côte d'Ivoire is still quite slow. Later shipments, they will come. The product is there. And Cambodia, this, I'm going to talk about it in a moment, but they got two surprises in Cambodia, indicated by the Vietnamese trade figures. Just to remind ourselves, 81,116 tons of raw cashew nuts exported, excuse me, by Vietnam in May 2025. The biggest month of any point in history. So it's difficult to be depressed about demand when you see those kind of numbers. What does it mean for raw cashew nuts? Well, I think buyers remain calm. It looks as if physical supplies, particularly in Vietnam, are adequate. maybe a little bit less so in India. India's imports up to the end of March, the last official figures that I have, 140,000 tons. That's quite modest. But time is running out. So these shipments are required. Demand still looks okay. So time is running out to make decisions. Logistics pressure, on the other hand, is building. There are stocks remaining in Ivory Coast. The material from Burkina Faso is beginning to move following the remarkable suspension. So those stocks are moving into an already under pressure market. And the stock in Bissau is built up, and I understand buyers have come a little bit later to the market this year than might have been hoped for. And put it all in perspective, the Southern Hemisphere crop starts in just 3 months. So it's moved on. People say time moves on quickly. It always moves at the same speed, but it just feels that it's moving on quickly when there's a lot of things going on. And we're looking at another harvest in September in the Southern Hemisphere. So that really puts perspective on this. So like most holders of raw cashew nuts, those who observe these facts are selling if they can. And that's what's putting a little bit of pressure on prices. So there are quite a lot of offers, slow buyers, slightly hesitant buyers, but they will need to come to market. One of the issues, particularly for Vietnamese processors, is that cashew kernels prices have also been under that little bit of pressure. If they stabilize, if buyers come in, particularly if there was a good resolution to the discussions around the US tariffs, that might, and certainly some Vietnamese processors tell me they're hoping for this, that might bring in US buyers to top up during the month of July when they know where they stand in terms of import tariffs. And it's complex because it's not always altogether clear who is responsible to pay an import tariff. So if a container's on the way, does the end buyer pay? Does the importer pay? Or do they both share it, or do they ask the exporter for a contribution? Well, as we know, in the cashew market, when prices are falling, everybody's looking at their supplier and trying to renegotiate. Not everyone, fortunately, as many people are. It wouldn't be surprising to see some renegotiation going on. And of course, if, and I think it's unlikely, but if it were to stay at a 46% tariff, well, as they would say in America, all bets are off. Move on, have a look at production, and we'll have a look, and I wanted to look at Cambodia first because of what I call the double surprise. So the first surprise is, of course, this number. Vietnamese customs authorities telling us now that the import in 2025, January through to May, is 873,000 tons. That's a lot bigger than last year. That's 100,000 tons bigger than last year at the same time. This is a big change. And it's interesting to put this in context. So if, for example, we thought with the same quantity between June and December as was exported to Vietnam last year, in other words, another 54,000 tons, that brings us well over 900,000 tons, plus whatever may have been processed in Cambodia for the crop this year. So we go back, let's have a look back at the history of the conversation around the size of the Cambodian crop. Now, I spent a lot of time working on Cambodia over the last 12 months. And when it came to January, we estimated that the crop would be around about 900,000 tons plus a little. That was based on the number of new trees coming online and the weather conditions to that point. By February, we were seeing estimates from various Cambodian trade associations, non-official, but nonetheless well-connected, that were talking the crop down from last year. Last year, about 840,000 tons. They were looking at 800,000 tons and a bit depressed when they talked about it. By April, and of course, by April, most of the crop is sold. But by April, the CAC, the association in Cambodia, was talking about a crop of 960,000 tons. And there is this fascination with the idea of a 1 million ton crop, which is going to come, but I don't think it's this year. And exported by May is 873,000 tons. So we see a lot of numbers all within the same range, but they don't quite make sense. If we look at it, I speak to a lot of farmers in Cambodia. There are some bigger farmers in Cambodia that can give you a good read on what's happening. And what they tell me is that the weather definitely affected some areas. It definitely impacted yield in some areas, but not in all areas. I spoke to some traders, and they told me that they couldn't see the volume of trucks that had crossed the border reflecting 873,000 tons. And they happened to be doing a survey. So I think their information is reasonably good. So I've got to ask the question, is there something wrong with these numbers? And if you recall, if you were looking at cashews in 2021, you will have seen a similar situation. So surprises in Cambodia, it's definitely a better crop than was anticipated during February and March. It's probably not as good as the CAC estimate, but it is a very good crop. Time will tell. The other country I think is topical, and we should have a look at the nature of the industry in this sector. So production, cross-border trade, and a feature and a feature again. So this information comes from some work I did together with the Lift Cashew project, and I'd just like to thank them for the use of that information today. Let's continue to look at Guinea-Bissau. So what we're seeing is, we're seeing that informal exports. So here you've got official exports in the light green bars, imports at destination. So this is India and Vietnam's combined imports from Guinea-Bissau. And you've got an estimate in the grey of informal trade. So that means cashew nuts that have crossed into Senegal and perhaps also into the Gambia, eventually through Senegal, from Guinea-Bissau illegally. So informal imports were growing in importance up to 2023. The authorities in Guinea-Bissau did something about that. They introduced some changes last year, and that trade petered away. Last year it was pretty low, but it seems to have returned this year, and it looks as if somewhere between 60 and 70,000 tons may have crossed into Senegal. That happened. Well, it's to do with costs, it's to do with port facilities, it's to do with regulation. So when we look at this, we see these are the various evacuation costs, again, thanks to the Lift Cashew project. Cost per ton, including taxes, loading, based in 2023 from the various ports. So Guinea-Bissau via Bissau port, Guinea-Bissau material via Ziguinchor, Guinea-Bissau material via Banjul, and the Dakar. And you can see big differences in the cost. So the complex regulation between the three countries includes big export tax differences from country to country. Taxes are much higher in Guinea-Bissau than they are in Senegal or the Gambia. And there is a problem of the export infrastructure. It's not to operate from, and over the years, vessels still there. And that's reflected in pricing. So understanding that is an important context to understand the Guinea-Bissau situation this year. What we see is probably this year a return to a pretty good crop. Better than last year, looks almost certain. Perhaps not as good as the 2022 or the 2023 crops, but nonetheless a decent crop. We're initial percent on last year, I think at least it's up by 12%. Now it is difficult to work this out. Why is it difficult? It's difficult because tracking the material that's crossed into Senegal until it's shipped and until it's recorded as export or import in India or Vietnam, we don't know for certain. So we're thinking a better crop, we're thinking stronger cross-border trade. What we do know is that there's more than 150,000 tons landed into Bissau port. We know that it's good quality material. We know that prices have come down to more realistic levels. They're pretty steady now. Buyers and sellers interested, but so far, up to the last time I updated on Monday, buying was relatively slow. There are some vessels loaded, bulk and container vessels on the way. And I think we should remind ourselves that Guinea-Bissau is the highest quality raw cashew nuts available until the Tanzanian crop in October, at least available in any volume. So Guinea-Bissau is an important producer. If we think in the context of Africa, there's only Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Tanzania, at least this year, ahead of Guinea-Bissau in production. So it is an important origin. It's also an important origin of high quality raw material, 50, 52 pounds, and that is priced accordingly. So I would expect this material to move relatively quickly once buyers start to get a little bit of clarity and start to pick up more material. So looking at that, we've looked at Vietnam, we've looked at Cambodia, we've looked at Guinea-Bissau. I still think we're looking at a good harvest. It's well advanced, good progress in West African countries. Okay, there is a little bit of a puzzle in Cambodia on the numbers. Either way, it's still a good crop. It's just a question of, is this a surprisingly big crop or is this just a good crop as we expected? And I just see in the last week, which needs to be thought about with new crop months away, that talk from Tanzania of a 20% increase on last year's crop. And last year's crop was a record. So all going well with the inputs properly distributed and the weather staying good, Tanzania looks like having another excellent crop. That material will be available to processors in September and at auction by the end of October. It played a very important part in the supply and demand scenario at the end of 2024-2025. Yes, people paid too much for it in the beginning, but in the end, it had a big impact on the pattern of trade in West Africa. So it needs to be watched very carefully. And we will, maybe not next time, but the time after that, we'll have a look at Tanzania in some more detail. So the outlook then, production estimates seem to be increasing. There seem to be more cashews around. Some of them are lower quality, but there seem to be more product around than we initially thought. Demand remains slow, but relatively steady. Kernels trade is impacted by the tariff issue in the United States. And it's impacted in a number of ways. And so it impacts, obviously, Americans' decisions on buying, but it also impacts Vietnamese decisions on selling, Europeans' decisions on buying. It impacts the import of products like almonds into India, which creates an oversupply, which softens demand for nut kernels generally. It impacts the way that buyers in China look at cashews as opposed to other tree nuts. So the outcome of this discussion, negotiation, whatever it will be, extension, probably the most likely outcome, after July 9th is really interesting. So July is going to be quite an interesting moment in the cashew business. It's going to be an interesting moment for world trade too. We'll know by then what that Cambodian crop really was. We will get some resolution, if only extension, of US tariffs. We'll start to get a better idea of the impact of higher prices. July could be, unusually, quite an interesting month in the cashew business. That's the market. That's the trade. That is how we're at the moment. Let's move on to our subject for today. And we're going to ask this question: has the market forgotten farmers? Well, this conversation came about when Herman Utterbusch, the founder and executive director of Fairmatch Support, contacted us and said, guys, you're not talking about farmers enough. And he had a point. Now, we did talk about farmers every now and again, but he had a point. So we said, okay, let's explore that subject. Have we forgotten farmers? Have we, at the global market encounter with Jim, have we forgotten it? Has the market generally forgotten it? And thus the question. Herman is as I mentioned, the founder and executive director of Fairmatch Support. Fairmatch Support is an organization that I find extremely interesting because it brings so many different types of stakeholders together. And it builds supply chains that are both sustainable and traceable and heavily active in the cashew sector. And I see Herman has joined us online. Herman, good morning to you. How are you?
Good morning to you, Jim, and thanks for having me. I hope you're well.
You're more welcome. It's a real pleasure, and it's great to see you online. And thank you for joining us. I know you are a busy man. So we wanted to
Recording in
I explained
progress.
it also at that setting. I think there is a myth going on already for 30, 40 years. And it's not only cashew, but I think at that moment, there was a trend of moving seriously thinking on supply chains, which I think was very good because we started to look on what are the actors within a supply chain, whether that be cashew, cotton, cocoa, whatever, and how can we improve? I think that setting seriously evolved and emerged and got a lot of improvement in the different supply chains. But in the end, what we forgot, and we started to talk as if they were cocoa farmers, or whether they were rice farmers, or palm oil farmers, or cashew farmers. And in the end, if you live and work and seriously work with farmers, you start to realize again, and as we do as well as Fairmatch Support, we realize the cashew farmer does not exist. They are still farmers, and they have different crops. And the way how they think and analyze on their potential in the market, that makes always a difference, that is always changing. And what we underestimate, and if you only look at it as a cocoa farmer or a cashew farmer, you might think they are only supplying, they're only producing to supply the market. And I think by thinking in that direction, I think we might have a lot of risks into the sector. So I think we have to rethink the model of how we look at the total supply chain.
Yeah, I get that. So where do cashews fit in this? We're talking about a transitioning farming sector. Where do cashews fit in that? And especially, where do they fit in the family farm economy?
I think currently it's a cash crop, but like you mentioned as well, I think my experience much more on the African continent and a bit on the Latin American continent, so less on the Asian. Let me be clear on that one. I think what we tend to look at if farming is a stable community and that there are no transitions taking place. Whereas if you seriously look into depth about it, there's a lot of changes going on. There's a lot of youngsters that are moving out. There's a lot of people from the diaspora that are coming back into the original countries and they seriously start farming in a different level. So I think currently cashew is seriously an important cash crop in the family setting, but that might change over time for a number of reasons. And we hardly analyze, for example, is cashew always an interesting crop for them? What are the competing crops? How do they make their decisions? Can we make and currently it's still almost what we could say, and I don't want to be negative, but it's still a little bit of a poor farmer's crop, so to speak, and it's one of the cashew crops. But does it also have the potential to become also make an income if it becomes a more professional, larger scale farming business model? What might occur in the coming, say, 10 to 15 years? We hardly look at it like that as a cashew sector. And I think by not doing it, we might run risk that in the end making the wrong judgments or the wrong stimulus to keep our suppliers that are very important to the total sector, to keep them in the right course.
So if we take West Africa as an example, so West Africa has been the driver of increased cashew production over the last 15 years or so, joined by Cambodia in the last 5. But do farmers in West Africa, for example, do they have choices what they grow in terms of which crops they grow or how much of them they grow?
Definitely. Every season, we talk quite regularly to farmers because we also do different crops like rice, like shade, like other crops. Every farmer at the start, like any other farmer in the world, they look at what was the last year, what is going to happen this year. If the market was poor on a specific crop, maybe we invest less, or we plant less, or the other crops are more promising. Currently, people think that maize is only, say, a crop for their own food, but there is a transition going on that maize is, especially in Ivory Coast, becoming a very interesting crop for the animal feed for the poultry industry, which is relatively easy to do, limited investment, and it's seriously making money. So farmers are seriously looking every year, what is my biggest opportunity, so to speak? And of course, in a risk spreading area, they never take something that they will change completely systematically, say 100%. That doesn't happen. We see similar things also in cashew, although cashew is a tree crop that makes it a little bit slower in the adjustment because you have to invest as a farmer for a number of years to get those trees. But everybody who is longer in this industry than, say, the last 4 or 5 years and has seen trends, at the moment prices go down, what do farmers do? They stop pruning. They stop cleaning because it doesn't make sense. And then, of course, after a couple of years, everybody is complaining, oh, the farmers don't understand. No, we have to train them. We have to do everything. I think the farmers know seriously well. But at that moment, they need to have a kind of feeling that the market is helping them again. And as long as they don't see that, they won't move. In some countries, I think Mozambique is unfortunately an interesting example for that. The trees have grown old. It's not because farmers don't know how to plant trees, but probably the market was not interesting enough for them in order to plant trees. So they moved to other crops. And of course, they picked every bits and pieces that was still on the trees. And I think, going back to that setting, I think we need to analyze more what is happening and realize that also in our, say, market analysis, and is the market still interesting for everybody?
So actually what we're missing here is perhaps we're underestimating farmers. Perhaps we are looking at this from I don't know, I hesitate to say it, but when we look at it from a development point of view, perhaps we're looking at it with all the emphasis on development and not enough emphasis on the market.
Exactly.
Does that mean that there's a risk? We saw it in Vietnam 20 years ago, but do you think there's a risk in the sector that farmers will choose to grow other crops instead of cashews, particularly in West Africa?
I think we always have to analyze it in what are their competitive other crops. And if something that goes easier, less investments, more support, let's also not do the other way around, that it's only the farmer who does it. If I know, for example, that I have a regular buyer that is loyal to me, in loyal in the sense of, well, he does what he says, that pays a reasonable price, the chances I will stay are seriously interesting because farmers don't move completely. They have a production plan of different crops. Mm-hmm. And then in that way, they also mitigate their risks and spread their risks. So I think that is what we also have to analyze. But I think, yes, we should, as a sector, we should think a little bit more. What is the future for, and also the future farming model and the future business model for farming, and which place would cashew have in that? And I think we should not think that everything is there for granted and will remain. I think that is the biggest risk we run as a sector, and currently we do, because what we observe, and I saw your analysis, it's not that long ago that I always had the figure of 3.5 million metric tons worldwide global production. It's only 5 years ago, and it's increasing. So can even figures that the sky is the limit, but as we all know, that might something what goes up might go down as well.
In fact, sometimes things that go up quickly go down quickly too. But on this, let's get a bit more constructive. What do farmers want from the market? What do they want, or what do they need from the market?
In that sense, it's in fact what every other entrepreneur wants as well. He wants a stable market, and I think entrepreneur, I mean those ones who have invested. We don't get me wrong. There's no judgment, but we have entrepreneurs that invest, and for me, farmers are in that category. And we have traders. That is more a short-term spot-on setting. And again, no judgment. But I think if you are an entrepreneur, if you invest in a factory, you would like to have a stable supply. You would like to have reliable buyers. That is your, and of course, you would like to make as much money as possible. But the continuity is the biggest difference. If I plant a seed in March and I have to harvest in say August, I would like to know whether there is a market and whether I can sell the stuff. Also, the last thing is very important. So I think what we need to do is give a couple of things. I think first we have to create a reliable market, so less speculation. Volatility in each sector is most of the time a key indicator that farmers in due time will move out, because it doesn't help them, it doesn't suit them. And I think that is one, and we can work on that by direct sourcing, by making connections to what is happening in West Africa. You mentioned Ivory Coast. I see more and more buyers that are getting connected to farmers. They buy from them year on, which I think year in, year out. I think that is a very positive development. But I think what is lacking still, they just see it as their continuing supplier. And I think you have to go one step further, think along and sit down with those farmers every now and then, check with them what are their plans, check with them how you could, if that crop is for you very important, how you could support them. And that is not always with more money, but maybe also with reliability, thinking along how they could improve their own business, etc., etc.
It's interesting because, I mean, Herman, you mentioned investors, and you describe exactly what we would expect from investors, that they would build long-term linkages to their supply chain, if for no other reason than to protect their own investment. We do see still very much, even with businesses that have invested heavily in processing, I feel that we still see that kind of trading business culture. So despite the investment, still quite a liking for speculation, quite a short-term thought process in terms of building supply chains. Would you agree that that exists amongst processors? They're not all making linkages.
I think there are different flavors at the moment, I would say, if we remain a little bit in the West African context. Yeah. I think we have the smaller to medium-sized companies that are seriously direct sourcing, and they create their own model, so to speak. I think that is definitely, and I think that is I hope also the future model. And then we have quite a big range of the ones in between that are partly processing and partly doing their RCN business, and they mingle it. In their partly processing, they seriously also work directly with farmers. So it's a mixed setting, and we have the conventional traders. What of course is happening, that especially also the middle group is coming from a trader background in the origin. If you look 10, 15, 20 years back, and they vertically integrated. Let me phrase it like that. But of course, your system of how you make money, and well, if you know the market very well, with speculation you can make money. Whether that is good for the sector is a different discussion.
Although we have seen in other industries that yes, you can make money in speculation, but longer term speculation often leads to implosion of an industry and the need to completely rebuild it. Excessive speculation in this business, 2016, 2017, we saw incredible price movements based on speculation when very little business was done despite big movements in price. So I think it's from what you're saying, I get the feeling that the current system is not really delivering farmers' needs, or if it is, it's only partially doing so, and that it's very much about who you might deal with, which processor you might deal with, which trader you might deal with, rather than just being in the cashew business as such. What do you think we can do to improve this situation, improve these relationships, improve the environment to encourage?
And these ones are seriously increasing and staggering. And what we should not underestimate, we talk, although we talk food as cashew, we don't talk as a basic food. It's not a staple crop. And I would not be surprised that in not too far from now, also the discussion will start on, are we going to use our land for food crops for ourselves? Or are we going to continue to produce export crops for the outer market? But it's more to let us, and I'm saying it not as a kind of threat or that I'm worried about it, but I think there's more happening in our total environment that we should take into consideration. And if we would like to see a very positive and modern cashew market, which I would like, so for me, I'm on the inside, so to speak. Then we have to think on what are the future models, and can it have a good place in a modern African society, because that will come.
It's a very good point. It's always interested me that the model of exporting high value, or better word, luxury products, cashews, cocoa, coffee, and importing food products, particularly consumer packed foods, actually doesn't really make any sense. It's almost like a hangover from colonial times in some ways. And I often think that combined with this transactional trading style culture is really holding our industry back. And I suppose the other thing we have is we don't have the involvement of major food multinationals directly in the cashew business, which may also have held it back. Perhaps it's just the fact that you can put raw cashews in a warehouse for a year and come back a year later and they'll still be usable. Perhaps that's something that's put the brakes on development too. So let me ask a very direct question. And do you think farmers trust the people they deal with? Do they think they trust the industry?
That's a big one. I think the majority of the trade is still, well, I mentioned there are different models. If you take the traders part, if you take the traditional part, farmers still sell to their local trader, so to speak, which sells to their local trader. So I think there's still a trust of community setting, so to speak. But I think it as a whole, I have my doubts sometimes. Although what I've also observed, and that is more on the total sector, if I look at the ones that did invest, and we have been involved in quite a number of them over the years, in good years and in bad years, but especially in bad years, at the moment you have a long-term relationship with farmer groups, then trust is there, and farmers start to seriously realize, I have to be with you also in bad times, because next year I need you. And that helps. So I think trust there is a variety of trust models, even I would say, like there is a variety of buying models as well. And the longer term it is, there's more trust. And like that.
So this is obviously a multifaceted question. So we have different models of buying, and within those different cultures and different styles, different levels of investment. Would it all change if we got to a situation where 100% of the crop was processed in origin? Would that change it, do you think?
I think it would change. Yes, because at that moment there is more competition on sourcing. The 100% we will never reach, and you should never do that because then that is the utopia. But say if it's 80%, so you have some played with the buffers. If it's 80%, I think yes, because then you also have a competition on buying, so you have a better equilibrium between pricing. And you know more about that than I do. But I think then you have a better logic. There is less speculation possible, especially if it's not, say, 4 companies that are managing the total supply of Ivory Coast. But if it's, say, a number of 20 to 30 factories, I think there's a serious opportunity. Then that is already part of the stability that you, or the decrease in volatility that you would like to achieve. And then the flows, of course, there is always volatility, but it does not go like this, but it goes like in smaller waves, which is more acceptable for all actors involved.
It's really interesting. You're really making me think here on this whole question of, have we forgotten farmers, or has the market forgotten farmers? So it seems to me that we need to modernize our relationship with farmers. We need to treat them as business people. We need to stop underestimating them for many reasons, but one big reason is that ultimately failing to do so will impact the level of production, and particularly the level of production expansion. Maybe farmers won't cut down trees, but they may stop looking after them, as you pointed out, Herman. But let me ask you one last question, and thank you so much. This is really thought-provoking. But let me ask this question. Why is it that it's you and me in this forum where it's largely traders, processors, development organizations, why is it that it's you and me end up being the ones to have a conversation about farmers?
That is a nice one. I think one technical reason is that farmers in this sector are hardly organized yet. It's increasing, it's improving, and I'm rather optimistic on that one as well. And I hope everything is in a transition, and I hope, Jim, that in 5 to 10 years, it's not you and me. Maybe we are still part of the discussion, but it will be an African farm leader who is making a point on how to adjust the sector in such a way that it also helps the farmers, so to speak. And I hope that a very talented African market analyst, a colleague of you, is sitting on the other side. And I see that as part of the transition. And I'm hopefully that will happen. And it should happen, and it has to happen.
It has to happen. Okay, let's leave it there on that optimistic note. Herman, it's been really interesting. I think as I said, you've provoked some thoughts. You've got me thinking about it. I'm sure you've got others thinking about it. Thank you so much for that contribution. Thank you for your openness on this subject. Let's go and see if there are any questions. Stella, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Good morning, Herman. It's good to have you. Thank you for your participation. And yes, we have a couple of questions. Let me start with those that are directed to Herman. Does it mean that in the future we cannot, for example, have a forum that talks only about cashews, but we will have to have the discussion also around other crops handled by the farmer? Will that not dilute the focus on the sector?
That's a fair question. I would not be in favor to have a platform where we discuss everything. I think the only thing what I'm trying to
Recording stopped.
what I would like to mention is that at the moment and I think it's for every actor in the sector, but especially in this one on the farmers, if you don't know what is where farmers are interested in, so your supplier, then you might miss opportunities. So I think what is more needed, especially for the ones that are buying from farmers, that there's more interest on what is their competitive advantage of buying cashew or producing cashew, and make that an analysis at that level. I think we should not adjust, say this kind of setting, and yes, please keep on going, analyzing the cashew sector as it is, but stop thinking that there is a cashew farmer that is a farmer that's only producing cashew. We have to realize and analyze every now and then, is cashew still an interesting crop? And if for example they stop pruning and if they stop cleaning, don't think that farmers are stupid. No, think that he or she decision and the crop becomes less interesting. That should be a seriously clear indicator for the sector. We are on the wrong side, so to speak. So we have to be cautious. So take it in that level. Let's not go for a total platform where we discuss rice, cashew, whatever crops. No, stick with cashew, but make your analysis a little bit further than just thinking that there is a cashew farmer somewhere. No, it's a farmer that produces cashew and other crops. I can't hear you, Stella.
Stella, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Another question to you, Herman. Is cashew really threatening food security in Africa?
Oh, I would not say that. I think that goes a little bit too far. The only thing is that I do, and I listened as well to Jim's observations. I do think, let's take Ivory Coast, and I might have already all the figures, like I had with cashew as well in my head. It's not too long ago that the consumption of rice in Ivory Coast was 1.6 to 1.8 million, and they only produce 6,000 metric tons in their own area. I think what the African setting should do is make a better balance between what they produce for their own food needs and their own food consumption, but and combine that with export crops that are interesting. So for me, it's not a decision take one or the other. No, make a good combination, because export crops gives you also revenues as a country, so that is very interesting. But make the combination, because if you only if you focus on export crops and you don't take care of your food crops, in the end your bill might be negative. Because let's not underestimate, if you have a food staple crop that you have to import all the time, that's a serious tricky one.
Thank you very much, Herman. I'm turning to Jim. We have also a couple of questions directed to you. As you mentioned about increased production estimates this year, but a lot of excess material in Africa now is of lower quality, which is not expected to be lifted by exporters to Asia and Vietnam. Does that indicate a shortage of availability of raw cashew nuts for Asia and Vietnam? But also what to expect to happen to lift this leftover ASEAN of lower outturn in Africa?
No, I don't think that we're looking at a shortage. On the contrary, I think that what we're looking at is a slower development of the season, a slower development of exports this year. But I do think that material will move. There will, I would expect, and there often is, some quantities left in some West Africa. That wouldn't be a first. If it's left, it tends to be held over to the following season and diluting quality. Then that does happen too. But what we're saying is that there is more material left in West Africa for the time of year. That doesn't mean that there will be more material left in West Africa 3 months, 4 months, 6 months from now. Based on the current trend of demand, yeah, we probably do have a little bit of a surplus on paper this year, but I don't think we will be left with 1,000 tons or anything that's hugely significant. So it's not yet a crisis. What we're looking at is we're looking to see how demand in the second half of the year will fare. I think we're seeing an industry in transition. I think we're seeing an industry adjusting to the arrival of Cambodia as a major producer of cashew nuts. That's only 4 years ago. We're also seeing a transition in the sense that China is becoming more and more an important market for cashew kernels. Into that environment comes a rather disruptive season last year, major changes in cashew policy across West African countries, and of course the uncertainty created by the imposition or potential imposition or discussion or negotiation, whatever word you want to use, of tariffs by the United States. So I don't think that this in any way could create a shortage of raw cashew nuts. I think anything that's left will be relatively modest, and it will be mixed in next year. So, as always, keep a close eye on the quality. Stella.
Jim, another question to you. When do you think we can expect kernel purchasing to improve? Can Chinese demand make up for the temporary loss of the US market for Vietnamese processors over the next few months? And should we also expect further correction in kernel prices across the board this season?
Well, let's put a little bit of context on this. One of the reasons that kernel trade has been a bit slow this year is because it was so good last year. So there were significant inventories brought, particularly the US market, from last year, which were probably a way of managing the risk of the introduction of tariffs. So that's one reason why it's slower this year, because it was so good last year. Secondly, uncertainty in markets like India, where there's been a little bit of a roller coaster at various levels in recent weeks, and uncertainty on the impact of higher prices. So what's happening now is that the market is adjusting to the prospect of higher prices. Now these are not, let's be very clear about something. Historically, these are not high prices for cashews. What we've seen is a period of extraordinarily low prices from which we've now emerged as of May 2024. We're wondering now what the impact of that will be. Now, if we were to look at the impact so far this year and to look at shipments, if we take Vietnam as a key supplier, it is the key supplier, exports are only down by 5% as at the end of May. That's a very modest response to a record year last year and a 32% increase in prices. So you would have to say that demand does look resilient. I think buyers come to the market when they get a little bit more clarity on the tariff situation. It's got two impacts. It's one is what will the tariffs be, who will have to pay them, but it's also got an impact on the economies. So the introduction of tariffs is definitely negative for the US economy, for example. Can Chinese demand make up for the temporary loss of the US market? Well, the US market accounts for about 25% of Vietnam's exports last year. The Chinese market was around 100,000 tons of 700,000 tons. So the short answer is no. Certainly in the month of May, yes, it did. Exports to China were really strong in the month of May, but exports to the US weren't bad either. So I don't think in the short term, a loss of the US market, if that were to happen, and that would only happen if import duties were retained at 46%, which is highly unlikely. In the longer term, I think there might be a different scenario. I think in the longer term, China could become as big as the US market. If the Chinese consumption of cashews were to continue to grow at the rates we've seen in the last 3 years, within 3 years, it could be the size of the US market. But that remains to be seen. It also remains to be seen in China how much the impact of higher prices will be on slowing the rate of demand. So over the years, what we've seen in cashews, and you can go back 30 years on this, what we see is that in periods of higher prices, normally higher than today's prices actually, what we see is a slowdown in growth. It's very rare, and there are only 2 incidences in 30 years where we've seen consumption actually decline worldwide from year to year. So I don't believe that we're going to see a major impact on demand if we get a 10% import duty rate. Now, a further correction in kernels prices, it's a good question. I wouldn't be at all surprised. I correction is probably too strong a word. Correction to me implies 20, 30 cents down. I don't think so. It's probably not a correction anyway. What we're talking about is, will the market tend toward the 5-year averages? I think that's possible. Had you asked me 2 months ago where I thought the market would be at the beginning of June, I would have guessed somewhere between $3.30, $3.40. It is $3.20 to $3.30 now. If you're asking me now, I think it could drift down another little bit. We could see WW320 prices approaching $3 a pound, but I don't think they'll stay there for long. I don't think that the forces supporting prices, strong demand, competitive prices, not as low as they were, but nonetheless workable prices, growing demand. And let's be very clear, we are in the middle of a boom in the demand for this product. We sometimes forget that. Sometimes we think a little bit short term. Sometimes we're worried about the price next week or the stock in the warehouse or whether or not our customer will honor their contract. When we look at this from a long-term point of view, we are in a period of tremendous growth in demand. What's perhaps caught us out a little bit in this market is the fact that Cambodia came so big as a producer so quickly. And that's unbalanced the situation. So by my calculations, within 3 to 4 years, that will rebalance and we'll be back to a typical scenario where, yes, from year to year, there are surpluses and deficits, but generally speaking, it's quite well matched. Of course, if farmers, as Herman was saying, were to decide that it's not worth looking after these cashew trees, if we were to see prices lower than would sustain farming activity and growth, that would change everything. But that won't happen quickly, as Herman pointed out. That's a great question. Thanks very much. I could talk about that question all day long. Stella.
Thank you, Jim. Back on the farmer issue, I think it would be a good idea to have a farmer join us on the GME. Emma?
I think that would be a seriously and good challenge, Stella. And
Yeah.
I agree.
Sorry. Emma, should we take last words from you?
No, I'm fine. I was very pleased to have this discussion. I think, and it's also good that Jim and I discussed it a bit in the past couple of months. And I'm very pleased that we put this in this platform as well. And I think it would also be wise, and it might also be interesting to have similar discussions. And we can start it because we built the sector jointly. Yeah? It's not that we can just observe and watch. And I agree.
And we're going to move slightly away from farmers to the next part of the chain. I'm going to ask the question, where next for African cashew processing? So we'll talk markets, we'll talk trade, and then we'll have a look at this question, where next for African cashew processing? I'd like to thank Herman and Fairmatch Support for participating today. It's a great discussion. That's what we need in cashews, more open discussion. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to you, Steph. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye, Jim. Thank you again, Jim. Thank you, Emma. And thank you to our partners and sponsors who made this webinar possible. Thank you to the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States, the GIZ Move Com Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nuts Initiative, and the Cashew Club. All Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick sessions are available on the ACA YouTube channel at African Cashew A, where you can watch over 81 recordings at any time. Mark your calendars, the 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo is taking place from November 18th to 21st of this year at GINEC in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. You register now and enjoy 40% off all conference rates. The network platform is available, and until June 25th, enjoy the networking session.